Hi, this is Chloe from Inner Whispers. In this video we'll be looking at the cards 25 through 30 from the ring to the lily. So here are some images of the ring from the kindergarten Lenormand and from the Celtic Lenormand. And the questions here include: when do people give or receive rings? And in the 1700s and 1800s, how serious a commitment was marriage? Who was affected by a marriage? So clearly, rings are very often given or received, particularly for engagements and for weddings. That's the most common thing in our modern culture. And so that's when people make a commitment to one another that they are going to love, honour and obey, or whatever the particular vows are that they choose. Other times that people get rings, you do also get things like rings of office. If we think about back in the past, people would also have, especially nobles, would have a ring that was perhaps their seal of office or the seal of their house. And so when they put that on a letter and sealed it, that was showing that this was who had written the letter, almost like a guarantee in some ways. And if you think also about how serious an affair marriage was, well, it wasn't just the two people who were getting married who were involved in it. It was very much a family occasion. So it was the way that families united their fortunes, and there were dowries and all things like that. So it was quite a serious commitment that was being made. And that's very much what we see implied in the ring. The ring is about commitment. There can be a level where it can be seen to be about something like an engagement or a marriage, but it's more general than that. It is about the promise, the guarantee, the commitment that you are making. We have all kinds of keywords such as agreement and commitment and engagement, partnership. We also see it as cooperation and even just the proposal before that actual obligation. At a more spiritual level or at a more general level, we also see it as being about renewal, circles and cycles, and also a connection more generally, and that feeling of alliance between families, for example, and a sense of completion. In terms of form, we would be looking at an actual ring or jewellery more generally, or a circle. And a spiritual commitment or karma can be more cyclical in the spiritual sense. For health, we have circulation, the cycle of fluids within our body, and also committing to a new health regime, or also chronic or repetitive diseases. Moving on to look at the book. The questions here are: in the 1700s and 1800s, how many people were able to read? And what kinds of books existed then? So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there weren't that many books around, really, if you think about it, compared to today, and also not that many people who could read them. 200 years before, there would only have been some monks that could read, and by this point there were more people, but they were all sort of aristocracy, nobles, maybe some sort of middle class if you think about accountants and so forth, but there also weren't very many books available. There were a few broadsheets, that kind of thing, but in many cases the only book that people would regularly have access to would have been the Bible. Now obviously this was a time when more things were developing, and so books generally were associated with knowledge, particularly perhaps religious or esoteric knowledge, and that's something that we definitely see in the book card. So the idea of secrets or mysteries is perhaps because for many people, even if they opened a book, they wouldn't be able to read it. And the books that you had were quite serious things, that they would contain information that was important and that was perhaps mysterious or not understood by most people. And that's kind of why you had to read it in a book, because it wasn't everyday knowledge. So all of those kinds of things come into our understanding of the book card, perhaps also to do with learning and study, research, and mysteries and secrets. If we look at the keywords, we see all of that. And if we think about the form, it could be a book itself, accounting ledgers, or a file. Spiritually, we might think of esoteric wisdom, being open to learning, or finding a spiritual teacher. And in terms of health, we're thinking about the unconscious, the appendix, or diseases with no apparent cause. So things where it's a secret or not understood why you have it. And the appendix, I think that's just because, you get appendices in books. So that kind of link at a different level. Moving on to the letter, we have some images here. And the questions: what are the consequences of something being written down? And how would you describe the physical aspects of a letter? If we think about the consequences of writing something down, one thing is that it can act as an aide-memoire, so it's a way to help us remember. But another thing is, you have contracts or other documents, things that are written tend to be taken a little bit more seriously. And if it's written down, it can be used at a later date, which is a positive, but can also be a negative. If you write something that you later regret, it's there in black and white and people might be able to use it against you. So in that sense, the letter is about the tangibility and proof or evidence. This is something which, as I say, some people see tweets as being the bird's card, but I would definitely see it as the letter, because there is that fact that, once a tweet is out there, you can't take it back and people can go and find it. It's written. It could be potentially used in a libel case, for example. So there's that evidentiary aspect to the letter. At a simpler level, it is anything that is written down, so it could be at a mundane level for things like shopping lists or your just daily to-do list, or anything that is written down and the act of actually writing it down. And if we think about describing the physical aspects of a letter, well, it's on a piece of paper, so it's flat, it's thin. In that sense, it can sometimes be used when describing a person to suggest someone who is superficial, that there are no more leaves in their book to be turned over, that's it. What you see is what you get. So it's that kind of either superficial or very clear, perhaps. What you see is what you get. So with the keywords, it really is any kind of document or written communication, and that sense of a paper trail can also be used for an invoice or will, of course. And form is a paper or a letter. In terms of a person, we might be looking at a journalist or some kind of writer, not someone who's writing a book. For an author, you really would probably go for the book itself. But someone who's writing shorter things, so these days it would also be a blogger perhaps. In the spiritual sense, we might think about omens and signs, or seeing the writing on the wall. And in terms of health, it represents hands, short-lived fevers, temporary irritations of the skin, temporary nerve strain, or a prescription. Next, we turn to the Lord, or man. And the questions here: if a man has a reading, which card would be used to represent him? Which man would have had most influence on or power over a woman in the 1800s? And what characteristics are most often attributed to men in Western culture? So clearly, if a man had a reading, then the man card is his card. However, it's also used for the person most important to a woman, if it is a woman who's having a reading. And back in the day, that would have been her husband if she was married, or her father if she wasn't, because that was who could determine her fate in many ways. These days, we really are in a different time, and so for me, I do see this as you could use it for the most important man in a person's life, in a woman's life. But there's so much more. We have relationships where it's not just man-woman. We have perhaps multiple relationships is another thing. And also, I think it's important these days to recognise the idea of the multivalence of images. So the man can represent a part of ourselves. It can be perhaps the type or the parts of ourselves that we might describe as manly in modern Western thought. Not saying that these are characteristics only men can have, far from it. It's precisely for that reason that a woman could use these to represent those aspects of herself, perhaps the more rational side, the more decisive side, the side that's more willing to take action, the side that's perhaps more aggressive. All of those sorts of things. You can decide whether or not you want to use those attributions, but that's certainly something that would be relevant for a modern Lenormand reader. So looking at the key words, we have nouns, all kinds of men, man, leader, friend, husband, partner, father, soulmate, and also self-esteem. And we have those descriptors of decisive and rational, conscious, manly, powerful. In terms of spirituality, we might look at this as our inner divinity or a spiritual role model. And for health, we're talking about male sexual organs, the right side of the body, yang energy or masculine energy. Moving on to the lady or woman, the questions are pretty much the same and the answers likewise. So, if a woman has a reading, then this is her card to represent her if you're doing something like a grand tableau. Obviously, if you're drawing less cards, then if it comes up, it might reinforce the fact that this is about her, but it could also be representing those aspects that are seen as more feminine, because if you use a grand tableau, then you look at the cards around the woman to see what is around the querent at the time, or the client. But if you're doing a smaller spread, then the question kind of determines what you're looking at. And so therefore this is when the multivalent sides of the card may be more relevant, thinking about it in terms of nurturing, mothering, caring, intuition, the unconscious, those kinds of aspects that we could potentially see in this card. We see all of those in the keyword. And you can obviously choose your own keywords that you feel are appropriate for a woman. So I've also put in here emancipated as well as caring and emotional, in womanly, intuitive or feminine. Once again, inner divinity as a spiritual reading of it, or that spiritual role model. For health, we have female sexual organs, the left side of the body, yin energy or feminine energy. And finally, we turn to look at the lily. And the questions are, whose crest showed the fleur-de-lis in France in the era of Mademoiselle Lenormand? And after the chaos of the Revolution, how might someone describe the French king? So the second question kind of gives away the answer to the first question. The King of France had a fleur-de-lis on his crest at the time of Mademoiselle Lenormand. And if you think about it, after the French Revolution, where there was so much chaos, so much upheaval, having the kings come back, it was seen as something that brought peace and harmony and stability. So this card was seen in a fairly positive light. It also, the cartomantic association is the King of Spades, so an older man who uses his mind, who is dependable, who acts in the service of others, those being kind of keywords for the suit of spades, which we'll look at in a future video as well. So this is someone who perhaps brings peace and harmony, and therefore peace and harmony are words that would go with it more generally. There are some people who also associate this with sexuality, and I think this comes from the fact that lilies were gifted at weddings, and obviously at that time a wedding was when people would start to have sex, both the man and the woman, though obviously it was considered more important that the woman had been pure up till then. So this is where the notions around purity but also sexuality come in and link to this card. So if we look at those keywords, we see all of these: family and sexuality, fertility, purity, harmony, innocence, serenity, maturity, elders, and also meditation, as well as things like coolness and cold weather. As a person, it's an older, kindly man, traditionally mainly dark-haired, a relation, friend or lover. And in terms of health, it is the sexual and reproductive organs, the lower body, hormones, and the healing power of meditation. So that's it for the cards of the ring through to the lily.